This is a battle cry for the American way of life and a relentless pursuit of truth and justice. It comes from a voice with unmatched experience and unyielding resolve. Join us as we dissect current events and tip the scales in your favor. This is Rally for the Republic with your host, Bryan Rudnick.
Hello, Rally for the Republic listeners. I'm your host, Bryan Rudnick. Today, I'm with a very dear and special person, Jonathan Feldstein, who's a friend of mine for a long time. And I teased on the last episode that he would be coming on, and fortunately, his schedule opened up so he could join us today. Jonathan, welcome to Rally for the Republic.
Bryan, it's great to be with you. Fortunately, we haven't started seeing the Hezbollah Iranian attack, which might impact my availability.
Okay, so let's do this quickly then, and we'll get into all of that. So I don't want to have to drag you out of a bunker for an interview. That wouldn't be safe. So the Rally for the Republic listeners know that I talk a lot about Israel and the importance of Israel and why, not just as a Jewish American, but all Americans should support Israel. And I wanted you on here as president and CEO of the Genesis 123 Foundation, because not only are you now an Israeli citizen, you are a U.S.-born Israeli citizen.
Correct.
You emigrated to Israel in 2004. From what I've seen of your bio, you've spent a great deal of your adult life creating bridges between Jews and Christians. Your work's taken you around the world, as I know, because I've helped you with some of that. And you're a highly published author and columnist, writing, and your works have been published in U.S. and international media. You've authored a book that we're going to talk about. You've got a podcast and the webinar series called Israel the Miracle.
Inspiration from Zion is the podcast.
I'm sorry. Okay. Sorry. I apologize. Inspiration from Zion. And you and you've organized a marathon in Israel called
Run for Zion.
Run for Zion. And you're the married father of 6.
Correct.
So that's a lot of responsibility.
Yes, it is. Don't remind me.
So where in Israel should the Rally for Republic listeners know that you live?
So I live in Efrat, which is a town in the Judean mountains, about 12 kilometers just south of Jerusalem. In no traffic, I'm in central Jerusalem in half an hour. In traffic, it can be an hour and a half. But we have a pristine view from my 7th floor balcony of all of Jerusalem and the mountains of Jordan and even the skyline of Amman when the sun is right. And behind me, we have a pristine sunset in the west. I always tell people this would have been the perfect vantage point to watch the 6-day war unfold in 1967.
Interesting. So, talking about wars, you're living there in Israel during a historic war, unfortunately.
Yes.
And I'm sure my American listeners here at Rally for the Republic would want to know, why would you 20 years ago want to pick up, leave, and move to a country that's always under attack from its neighbors?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's actually 20 years this week. On Thursday, my family and I are going away just to get away. Hopefully we can, to celebrate our 20th anniversary. We moved here 20 years ago with 5 children, ages 11 to 3. We now have 6 children, almost 19 to 31, with the 19-year-old going into the Army next week. And 2 of them are married. And one of them has 3 children. And God willing, in a month from now, we'll have her 4th child. Why? Because when I was a kid, my father was born here, which made me, I refer to him as an original Palestinian because he was born in 1937 when the only people referred to as Palestinians were the Jewish population here by the British, who were then controlling the land. And when I first came here as a teenager, I knew I wanted to live here. And somehow, even though I was a kid myself, I knew empirically it was a better place to raise children. So fortunately, I met my wife, who also had that same kind of understanding and desire to live here. We got married 33 years ago, and both we were initially on the 7-year plan, but then my father got sick and died. Things delayed. It took us a few more years to make it. But I have to say, it's ironic. Up until now, full stop, that's my story. But we're 10 months into a horrific war. My son has served in Gaza. My son-in-law, the youngest son, is going into the Army next week. I wouldn't choose to be anywhere else. This is the place where the Jewish people belong. This is the canary in the coal mine and the front line against Islamic extremism, not just here in the Middle East, but all over the world. And this is the land that God gave us. So my goodness, why would I not want to be here? It's been great, not without its challenges, but it's been great, and would do it again tomorrow.
Could you elaborate on what those challenges were before October 7th of last year?
Well, I'm 59 years old. I've spent most of my life in America. Culturally, I'm an American. There are cultural things here that are always going to irk me and annoy me, and cultural things that are just different, and you get used to. But it's part of the charm of Israelis, that you can get in an argument. I won't be vulgar, but get into a nasty argument with somebody on a Thursday and end up your argument wishing one another Shabbat Shalom and leaving, or cutting yourself off in a car, getting cut off in a car, etc. There are many challenges. And of course, life-threatening. I've realized not before October 7th, but since, my kids collectively have been to more funerals this year than I've probably been in my life. And these are things that you raise your children. You want to protect your children from horrors like this, but I feel like, while it's traumatizing, some of the stuff that we live through, and by the way, we lived through this 10 years ago when the 3 boys were kidnapped from the area where we live, and our whole neighborhood was populated with soldiers living in our communal buildings, the synagogues and community centers. These create trauma, but they also create a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging, and a sense of wanting to be part of it. And I'll just give one more anecdote. My youngest son has asthma, so he can't go into a combat unit. Next week, when he goes in, he's going to refuse orders on day 1 to be drafted into the position that the Army is saying they're drafting him into, because it's not meaningful enough. We raise our kids, and I don't mean me and my wife, I mean we in Israel. We're raising our kids with values to contribute, to serve, that we're living out our past, and we're building our future. And I'm so proud of my son that next week, unfortunately, the Army swung and missed. And so my son's got to spend a couple of days in military jail in order to get a position that's properly meaningful. But that's the kind of values. Challenges, because you want your kid to do well and have a meaningful 3 years, but great values as well.
There's some pretty powerful things you've just said. I don't think most Americans will fully appreciate that, because we don't live under the risk and terror threats that you live
Correct.
And what's it like to be in Israel since October 7th?
Everyone is suffering trauma to one degree or another, myself included. And we're in the midst of it. There's no post-traumatic stress disorder. We're just in traumatic stress disorder right now. There's grief, and someone who was following now and listening, and maybe lost a friend or loved one at some point, a grandparent, even whatever it is. You know that death brings loss and grief, and you need time afterward. And there's all kinds of things to mourn and grieve. But we haven't had a break to pause the mourning, to pause the fear. My oldest son is getting called back up into reserves the beginning of September. My daughter's boyfriend, serious boyfriend, was called up already. We don't know when there's going to be. I joke about it, and humor helps me get through the trauma, the stress right now of literally not knowing when we're going to have an imminent attack from Iran or Hezbollah in Lebanon. But my goodness, I said it before, there's no place I would rather be. There's no place I would rather have my kids. But trauma, stress, grief, it's pervasive. And honestly, Bryan, I think that it should be. I think if we're not feeling it, then we're not properly living at this period in Jewish history where we should be traumatized, because the things that we're going through and the threats facing us are quite horrific.
So you and I know each other a long time, and before we started working together years ago, I knew you from prior professional activities you were
Correct.
in. And we got to bond, and you and I got to know each other working to build bridges with Christian Zionists in America who have been great supporters of Israel. And you took a lot of that work and you started this organization, the Genesis 123 Foundation. Could you elaborate on what your organization had been doing prior to October 7th first?
Wow, that's a good question. Right. So anyone who wants to follow what we're doing can go to genesis123.co. Our mission it sounds real simple. We build bridges between Jews and Christians with Israel in ways that are new, unique, and meaningful. So what that means is I'm not going to be the next Orthodox Jew teaching Torah to Christians. There are many, and they're very good at it. And I don't want to compete, and I'm not looking to carve out a niche or take a piece of the pie from others. I'm looking for unique ways in which we can build bridges. So for instance, you mentioned in the intro, Run for Zion. When we started in 2017, it was with the blessing of the mayor of Jerusalem at the time to create the first Christian program around the Jerusalem Marathon, which nobody had ever thought of, much less actually implemented. And when I presented the vision to him and the whole business model, which he loved. If you or someone listening know who Nir Barkat is, he's now the minister of economy, I think, in the Knesset and in the government. But then he was mayor of Jerusalem. He's a entrepreneur, one of Israel's wealthiest politicians, a runner himself. And when I presented the idea, he got it. He understood that if you're a Christian, Jerusalem is the most significant place in the world that you will run. And if you're a serious runner, that even means more significant than Boston, New York, Tokyo, London, etc. So we launched that. We do things, you're great at help in terms of generating revenue, donations for the projects that we've been funding over the years. We're reaching out to kids and their parents in order to build bridges among younger people, because that's also not something to be taken for granted. You'll talk about our book that we just published 11 months ago. It just came out 11 months ago, right before the war began. Again, a unique opportunity, but not everything that we're doing is about fundraising, and it shouldn't be. It should be purely about building bridges. So over the years, we've also hosted wild prayer events by Zoom and YouTube. The longest one was 13 hours. It went literally around the world. The last one we did, you'll like this. I don't know if we spoke about it at all. On May 15th, out this year, our enemies, our neighbors, call it the Nakba, the catastrophe of Israel's existence, because that's the day on the secular calendar in which Israel was born. So we flipped it and brought Jews and Christians together, thousands from all over the world, praying for 6 hours live. And you know this, Jews don't typically feel so comfortable praying with Christians, but it was incredible. It was inspiring. We prayed that the hostages should be released. We prayed for the safety and success of the IDF. And we even prayed that our enemies' hearts should be changed. Because sure, we'll beat them if we have to, but it'd be much easier if God could change their hearts the way he went on and off changing Pharaoh's hearts. So these are just some of the projects that we do. Oh, I should mention the brand new one. As of 2 days ago, we launched publicly. It's called Root and Branch. We're bringing Christians to volunteer in Israel, harvesting olives in October, because olives are so significant biblically, especially in the New Testament. So we're going to step up and along the Gaza border area, harvest thousands of trees and create olive oil as a commercial product that can create revenue back for these communities that were so devastated on October 7th.
So I remember when you first started the organization, you were doing work like some other groups of helping people who were injured from various random attacks in Israel. You were working to take care of a lot of orphans and children who were suffering as a result of some of those attacks. You were helping Holocaust survivors who, while there's still a very small portion left, are pretty poor these days.
Correct. Actually, there are many more who are poor because so many Holocaust survivors came from the Soviet Union. When they came here, they were my age and or younger, but they came with no pensions. So now that they're old people, they have no pension, and we're seeing tremendous poverty. We're seeing, you're right, and thank you, because I digressed from your actual question. Orphans and at-risk youth, widows, Holocaust survivors, soldiers in so many ways. We've had this program for years, which we do now in the summertime, where we just bring 100 kilos of watermelon and cut it up at soldiers where they're posted all over the streets in the area in which I live, all the way down to Hebron. Really, but it's direct, meaningful, hands-on ways to engage, but also to be able to show that most of our support is coming from Christians, and letting Israelis know that the Christians that we feared 80 years ago in Europe are not the people who love us today.
And since the war, you've been doing tremendous work supporting the soldiers, Israel's security forces, and even civilians suffering from the trauma you talked about earlier.
Correct.
Could you elaborate on some of that? I know
Sure.
we've done some great projects together, and I think everyone should know what you've been doing.
So also feeding soldiers is sort of, pun intended, I suppose, the bread and butter. In the winter, we made just about every week, I would make a big pot of soup here in my house because I keep kosher, and would drive around with friends, usually Christian friends who were visiting from the States, and serve out soup to soldiers with a nice big fresh piece of bread along. And that's really appreciated. Some of our listeners will also know what shakshuka is, basically poached eggs in a spicy tomato sauce. One day in the middle of the day, when it was super cold, I made a big batch of that and went and served that to soldiers in the area. And now in the summer, hot, cold watermelon and drinks. And as of this week, I don't think I even told you, we were asked to buy new coffee makers and get hundreds of pods, so soldiers who are stationed in the area can have at least a decent cup of coffee when they have a few minutes of downtime. So those are and the big one that we did this summer, in addition to life-saving equipment, was we provided over 1,000 winter jackets to soldiers, because when they were called up on October 7th, forget the equipment they didn't have winter clothes. So we were able to, with thanks to the donations that you helped to bring in and others, we were able to raise the money and donate over 1,000 jackets to soldiers, which were so appreciated across the spectrum of all kinds of different units. We were responsible for helping to relocate and settle a whole community just north of the Gaza border from about the middle of October to the middle of November, where we paid for their hotel, we paid for their food, we paid for activities for the kids so that they could manage the best living in a hotel coming out of the trauma of October 7th. We're still dealing with at-risk youth. That's a very big long-term project that we've launched. The kids who suffered on October 7th in the Gaza border area are suffering all the more now. The trauma that they experienced compounds the problems that they come from. So we are raising, it's a campaign, we haven't even spoken about it, probably close to $1 million to be helping at-risk youth with therapy, with a new building that's built to be bomb-proof. And actually that building during the war took a direct hit from a rocket. So we know that it works. We know that the construction standard is proper. And as I mentioned, the prayer events. Oh, and you mentioned my articles. Between somewhere in the range of 150 articles, no less radio and TV interviews, briefings that I've done. The advocacy has been critical because at best the media is inaccurate, and at worst it's malicious. So we need to get the truth out.
So talking more about the truth, as I know from working with you and helping you, especially since October 7th, I mean, you've been all around the country. We've published some videos with you. You've been with troops on the front lines. You were there as they had to shell northern or southern Lebanon, if I recall.
Yeah.
You were there to see the Iranian missile or rocket that hit down in Israel on the army base. You were there to give troops, as you mentioned, winter coats. But before that, you were giving them tactical vests and bulletproof vests and helmets and flashlights and medical kits. And as you pointed out, right, they had to leave. I mean, did your sons have everything they needed when they were called up right away?
Oh, and honestly, Bryan, It was terrifying, and it was a hard thing running a nonprofit. It was horrible. My son went in. He was called up October 7th, 4 p.m. in the afternoon. He left the house and went down the next day. The next day he was in Kibbutz Kfar Aza, where there were still live terrorists, and he said that was even more scary to be there than in Gaza itself for the 2 months that he was in. But he went in, and many of his soldiers without bulletproof vests, without other really important equipment. So that was a big deal at that time. The army's more or less caught up, but I had quite a dilemma. What was I going to do? Buy some bulletproof vests and give one to my son, and the 84 other men in his unit wouldn't have? That didn't seem appropriate. That would not fly well with him being the one guy with the proper bulletproof vests. So we did get some. It became much more complicated as the war progressed. Eventually, the army caught up. Eventually, I understand people going into battle have the equipment that was necessary. But at the outset, it was very harrowing.
Was it a factor of Israel's bureaucracy, Israel's lack of preparedness, or just the surprise of the attack?
All of that. I don't think anyone had the imagination that there would be an attack like this, that 300,000 soldiers would be called up at one time and 350,000 showed up. No one planned. This is the longest war except for the War of Independence. No one planned that no one imagined on October 7th that on that on the 11th and 12th of August, 10 months later, we'd still be fighting a war. In the fourth season, we started in the fall, we went through the winter, spring. Now we're in the height of the summer, and we're going back in a month to the fall again. And so no one had the equipment. There's not a storeroom in Israel with 300,000 winter coats. Just didn't exist. So it was all of that lack of preparedness. But I'll tell you something else, and you'll like this. I don't know that we've spoken about it. You'll like this. It makes sense. Because the war is not the war is against Islamic terror. Hamas is our front line at the moment. But what do we see coming out of Yemen? The Houthis. They've taken over Yemen. They're controlling major shipping routes. As a result of that, we see global shipping prices go up. The supply chain to get things from one part of the world to another increasing, and therefore the price of shipping is increasing. And therefore, we weren't able to even get the jackets as quickly as needed. We had to wait between our first and second delivery of jackets. We had to wait a month in order to be able to get the supplies, the raw materials to be made into the jackets to be able to deliver them. So all of this, it's not just the lack of preparedness in Israel, it's how it also affected the global economy.
You are listening to Rally for the Republic with your host, Bryan Rudnick.
So I'm here as we're talking, and I'm looking on my screen above that I've got several browsers open with Israel-based media, and it's day 310 of the war.
Yeah.
And there's not one headline that is like uplifting. There's a Hezbollah attack, a commander killed in Lebanon. There's Israelis killed in the West Bank today. The IDF's hunting for shooters. This is pretty much nonstop, everyday activity now in Israel, isn't it?
Oh, that, along with the doom and gloom of waiting for the Iranian and Hezbollah escalation. Yeah, it's really
you have to scroll down quite a bit before you see a nice uplifting story about Israel's Olympic winnings.
I was just going to say we won our 7th medal with the rhythmic dancers, and that was beautiful. But yeah, you have to scroll way down before you're getting anything uplifting. Yeah.
Yeah. The United States media is saying that Israel is attacking civilians, and the leftist politicians in the United States are carrying forward that kind of bias. What is the truth? What do you hear? Did Israel properly and surgically strike a Hamas base, or did they go after civilians?
In all cases, we're going after. We're conducting surgical strikes. There was, I'm not exaggerating, I think there was one mistake during the course of the war where something some explosive device was close to a place that was being blown up from the air, and shrapnel triggered an explosion, which did kill some civilians. But honestly, Brian, I don't know when this war is going to be over physically. But I don't know if it'll be in our lifetime, but I believe that this war will be celebrated because the nonsense. Look, civilian casualties are horrible. Who are innocent civilians when many civilians are holding hostages and were the ones who broke in and committed horrific acts of terror on October 7th is a whole other conversation. But nobody in Israel is gunning for civilians. And the fact that the ratio is of combatants to civilians is awfully close to 1-to-1, assuming you believe the Hamas numbers to be accurate, which I don't think there's any basis to believe. They're saying about 40,000 people total have been killed, including all the terrorists who broke into Israel on October 7th, including all of the terrorists who have been killed, which is 15, 16, 17,000 of them. And we know because we're targeting them. I'm proud of it. I don't want kids to be killed. I don't want their parents to be killed. But that's not happening. There's not a genocide. There are not war crimes. When Kamala Harris was on the news again this week talking about civilian casualties, she's so vapid that she doesn't even have the substance to back it up. And she makes these very broad claims, whether she actually believes it or if she's just pandering to the Hamas wing of the party. But my God, that's the message that trickles down everywhere. And people believe it. And people believe it in the conservative media as well.
Do a lot of Israelis pay attention to U.S. politics when it relates to Israel?
It's a very good question. Not as much as I do because I'm an American citizen. I'm a real proud American citizen because I pay my taxes in America, because I vote in America. So no, not as much. I don't believe most Israelis pay as much attention to the U.S. media as I do. But I don't think that there is an occasion or more than a handful since the beginning of the war that we can count where there's been a really positive message about Israel in the media. There have been accurate defenses of Israel in terms of certain instances, but in terms of the righteousness of this war, in terms of the necessity, not just for Israel, but for the West, I think that most Israelis just come away with the fact that we're all alone. And I'll wrap up this answer by going back to the very first day that we handed out those winter jackets. We went to a intelligence base. Now, intelligence soldiers don't typically get all these goodies, but we went to an intelligence base in the northern part of Israel, handed out, I think it was about 100, 150 jackets there at this base. And the soldiers were so grateful. This was December. It was Christmas Eve. The soldiers were so grateful and articulated how alone they felt and that this made a difference to them. So I think that that's probably the overall sense that Israelis have. And that's why what I do with the Genesis 123 Foundation, showing Christian support for Israel, is so positive and uplifting.
In the United States, as you apparently know, there's been a lot of ramping up of anti-Semitism. It's led by a lot of politicians on the left and their supporters. And the Jewish community played a big role, especially with AIPAC, defeating people like Jamal Bowman in New York earlier this summer, and this past week, Cori Bush. And she was one of the squad members, and she was defeated. And is any of that rippling through in Israel? Are they saying, oh, we're finally, the Jewish community there standing up for us?
That's a great question. That definitely is making the media here. I don't know how many Israelis really understand. I think that it just the fact that the squad exists, I refer to them as they're not progressive. That's not a right word. They're pro-terrorist. They're pro-Hamas, and there's so many of them, including Nancy Pelosi and my own Congresswoman Bonnie Watson Coleman in New Jersey. These are all people who are unabashed pro-Hamas, anti-Israel, and it's disgusting. People know it a little bit. The sad part of what you said, which remains true but is inaccurate nonetheless, is talking about the Jewish community standing up. Because the thing I wrote an article a few weeks ago called "The Last Zionist Democratic President." Whether we like Joe Biden or not, and whether we believe he's a Zionist or not, he self-identifies as a Zionist, and he has for a number of decades. But what we're seeing now, proving my concept, or my theory, is that we will never in our lifetime, I believe this, Bryan, see a Democratic president who may be pro-Israel, but actually put that on his or her resume. And in fact, we saw the opposite. We saw the governor of Pennsylvania have to walk back his pro-Israel stance after not even being accepted as the vice presidential candidate. So people do see that here, but I want people to see, I hope that it is seen, that it's not the Jewish community, but the pro-Israel community, because the pro-Israel community consists of 80 to 100 million Christians in the U.S. who love Israel and support the projects that are essential for undermining, for undercutting all of these people.
So before we run out of time, I want to go over a couple more things.
Sure.
First, I think it's important that we talk about your book. Last year you published Israel the Miracle, and I think it's quite a unique book. And would you tell this Rally for the Republic listeners what it's about, what your vision and purpose was in creating this book?
Thank you. So anyone who's interested can have a look at israelthemiracle.com. The book was an idea that came to me in October of 2022, 6 months before Israel was celebrating its 75th anniversary. And I realized that, in fact, piggybacking on what I just said about Christian support, there's never been a publication of essays by Christian leaders from all over the world writing about why Israel is so significant. So on the occasion of the 75th anniversary, I thought, okay, let's go and publish such a book. And I went to a friend who's a publisher, not far from you in Orlando, and he improved upon the idea tremendously. And somehow miraculously, and I don't say this as an overstatement, I didn't know that most people can't publish a book like this within a year, but it was done from conception to delivery to the printer was literally 9 months. But what's so magnificent about the book, I wish people could see it now, but go to israelthemiracle.com. You can flip through the pages. By the way, anyone who's listening and wants to get a copy, please use the discount code Jonathan10 at the end and you'll get a 10% discount. The book is a coffee table book. So there's 75 essays by Christian leaders all over the world writing why Israel is significant to them. And they're 75 leaders from their 20s to their 90s, multiple ethnicities, every continent except Antarctica, multiple denominations. And honestly, Bryan, it's super inspiring. It's historic because it's never been done. And we weren't setting out to publish a book that was prophetic, but when you read the book after the war began, the book came out the third week of September. So literally 2 weeks later, we were at war. When you go back and read some of these essays, you realize, in fact, how prophetic they are. And we've now printed two printings here in Israel. The second one supporting the print shop in Kibbutz Be'eri, which is along the Gaza border, where 101 of their 1,200 members were massacred on October 7th. So all of the book comes back to supporting Israel, from the actual printing and binding and shipping to the proceeds that go to our Israel Emergency Campaign.
That's wonderful. Really great job. What do you think is the number one thing Israelis want the rest of the world to know about the country, the people, and what's going on there?
Right now, I think Israelis want people to know that we didn't want this war. It's not the battle is what's new. The war is ongoing. The war is 100 years. It's against Islamic extremism. But this is a war that came to us, and this is a war. Everybody knows it. It's not rhetoric. This is the worst trauma to the Jewish people since the end of the Holocaust, the most number of people killed on any one day, and we're still experiencing that. This is a war that proves the statement that if Hamas, the terrorists, were to lay down their weapons and surrender, they would and give up the hostages, they could have peace tomorrow And if we were to lay down our weapons and surrender to them, we would be destroyed the next day. And we see that.
Phrasing Golda Meir.
Correct. And it's an obligatory war. Judaism has two concepts of obligatory war and optional, I think, is the translation of the second kind into Hebrew. This is obligatory and it is existential. I'm not so worried about Iran destroying Israel, but the existential concept of the runaway extremist Islam must be stopped. I hope that the show of force that the U.S. has displayed here in the Middle East now will be used if necessary. The truth is, I would be for a preemptive strike against all of these terrorists because we have to beat them back. We can't wait for them to attack us and then respond in kind. We have to beat them back. This is a war. We know this even just this week. The Trump campaign says Iran broke into their website or to their data. Iran is everywhere.
They hacked their files and got some sensitive files on James
Hack
Vance.
the files. We need to push back, and we is not just Israel, but we will continue to do it on our own if we have to.
Is the threat from Iran stopping Israelis from living their life right now?
Some
are people going on their daily business?
We're going about our daily business, but we're preparing. I'm not living in fear, but I'm mindful of the fact that tomorrow morning when I go into Jerusalem for a doctor's appointment, that I could be a couple of hours away from my home. And if that's when the attack strikes, I want and need to be in my home. I'm limiting where I go. I'm mindful of the fact, I'm careful of the fact that my daughter is in her third trimester with 3 little kids and they need help. And 2 of my daughters live in building apartments in Jerusalem where they don't even have bomb shelters. So all of this plays into the pace of life. But I think most Israelis are trying their best to just go about what they need to do, make plans, and realize that at any moment those plans could change radically.
You're still running Genesis 123 Foundation and doing your part to help Israel in the war effort. What can the listeners of Rally for the Republic do to help you continue your mission? Are there specific projects they can help you with? How would you like that support?
Sure. Thank you. So at genesis123.co, of course, everyone is invited and encouraged to donate even $1.50 for a cup of coffee for soldiers through our Israel Emergency Campaign. Everything makes a difference. We have a petition still for the release of the hostages. It's not to bring them home. The charge is not against the state of Israel. Of course, we have a responsibility, but we have to look square in the face of the terrorists who are holding 115 human beings and put the onus on them. So sign the petition at genesis123.co. The one thing we haven't spoken about yet, and I can get into if you want, we've launched a very bold initiative. It's called solutionforpeaceingaza.com. And I encourage people to go there and just register to join for information, because what we are proposing is the actual solution for peace. And it goes back to an earlier question that you want. We actually want peace. And we want prosperity for our Arab neighbors. No one's going to load them on ships and kick them out or drive them across borders. They're here. They're our neighbors, and they're here to stay. And they should be prosperous, and they should live without fear of under the heel of the terrorists themselves, because they've suffered much more under the terrorists than anything Israel's ever done. But we're proposing to bring 100,000 Christians to Gaza to rebuild and rehabilitate all of Gaza and expose Gazans to love from the West, typically West, but might not only be Western Christians, to love from people who actually have a relationship with the God of Israel, and will teach them that love is pure, that God loves all people, and Allah is not God, and their Allah has failed them, and that actually if they want peace, they need to understand that the Jewish people are chosen by God, and that we are part of the solution, not part of the problem. Solutionforpeaceingaza.com is the website. And what we're trying to do right now is affect a top-down approach, influencing leaders to adopt this and promote it, a bottom-up approach, so that it becomes the plan, rather than the whole nonsense that I referred to in my Washington Times article recently, a two-state illusion.
It's interesting you mentioned something that I think a lot of the Rally for the Republic listeners, a lot of Americans don't often hear. I know it's in the media. I've read it even in some of the liberal media, but people need to be mindful of and remember that a lot of these people who live in Gaza are poor. Some of them have skills like people throughout the world, doctors, lawyers, accountants, tradesmen, but they themselves in many respects are hostages because Hamas and Hezbollah are controlling those areas.
Hamas, Hezbollah, I didn't mention when you asked where I live, I told you the town. I'm saying in quotes, a settlement. We're over the Green Line. People refer to it pejoratively as the West Bank. The significance of it is closer to where I'm sitting talking to you right now than any of the communities that were overrun and devastated by terrorists on October 7th, is a Palestinian Arab village called Abdullah Ibrahim. And in between us, there's a gate that workers came through October 6th. We haven't had anyone coming through there because they're not allowed. There's a very healthy debate, and it's profound for another conversation, as to whether these Palestinian Arabs should ever be allowed to come back. We don't want the financial harm that's coming to them by not being able to work in our community and other Jewish communities like this, but we also don't trust them because we learned from October 7th that many of the terrorists were in fact workers in these communities, or the workers gave intelligence to the terrorists. So they knew, and I've witnessed it, Brian, they knew exactly where the rapid response team members were. They knew where the arms were stored to protect the communities. They set up snipers to kill the people who were most threatening first, and then they went house to house, slaughtering average people, burning people, raping, dismembering bodies, all of the horrors that took place. And so there's a very healthy reason why people in Efrat, in the region in which I live called Gush Etzion, don't ever want Palestinian Arabs to come back. Not because we hate them, simply because we can't trust them.
Before we end today's interview, one of the things Genesis 123 Foundation has done, I've been happy to work and honored to work with you on, is at times we've raised money to provide emergency life-saving backpacks and supplies.
Correct.
For civilian security forces.
Correct.
I think it's important you actually talk to the Rally for the Republic listeners and outline for them why you're doing that. Why is that? Because that's a foreign concept here in the United States, right? Most Americans live in a state where we're allowed guns, we're allowed to go to Home Depot and buy supplies. And if we want to be preppers, worried about, like I live in Florida and hurricanes are coming and people might have, electric saws to cut down the trees after hurricane and tarps. And right now the state of Florida has like tax relief for buying hurricane supplies and things like that. But in Israel, it's very different. You would need different kind of supplies for different emergencies.
Yeah. So in Florida, more than perhaps many places in the rest of the U.S., you have a phenomenon called gated communities. We have that as well, except the gated communities are meant to keep out terrorists, not people who are just coming in, and there's actual profiling. It's honestly quite funny that when I go visit donors in Florida or Texas or other places where they have gated communities, security there is actually often much tighter than it is coming into our communities. But why is this stuff needed? We live next to each other. The listeners can't see my fingers wrapped on top of each other, but we are on top of each other like that. And what we learned from October 7th is we can't trust them. And I don't say that with any pride. I'm not happy about it. It's the reality. So there are drones that are needed to fly over their communities to check out where they're building bunkers to store things, or new piles of dirt that might indicate that they're building tunnels trying to come in under us. Not to mention my son-in-law, who, for instance, is on the rapid response team here. He says they need night vision equipment. They need all kinds of other training. The weapons themselves are provided by the community, and that's essential. But we live in a place where the army, if there were to be an October 7th style event that took place. The army will take a while to get here. And so civilians are armed and part of this team, and they do fine. But now we have to look at it from a completely different perspective. And we've done great work together, Bryan. It's been uplifting. It's been so helpful. And I'm grateful for that. But I don't even know how to say it without sounding like I'm whining about it. There are hundreds of communities like mine still along the Gaza border. I just got another request last week, and in fact, you'll like how I responded, and we'll talk about that, from a community along the Gaza border for their rapid response team, along the northern border where I am. Everywhere, they need more equipment. And frankly, so far from our perspective, the fact that there's still that much more equipment needed indicates that we just need more money. So that's our reality. Anyone who wants to contribute can be in touch at genesis123.co, or just go ahead and straight make the contribution. But these are our realities, and it's a new reality. It's not a phase. This is the new reality. In matter of fact, I've articulated, I don't have a gun yet, but I realized just in the last few weeks that it's time. It's time.
Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us at Rally for the Republic and providing your insights, your wisdom, your knowledge, and helping everybody to understand the threats Israelis face and what you're doing to help meet the challenge that unfortunately you're stuck having to meet.
Well, I appreciate
it. God bless you. God bless your family.
Thank you, Bryan. I appreciate it.
We all wish you well, and we'll keep you in our prayers as you and your family and everybody in the state of Israel tries to remain free and safe. And hopefully very soon, God willing, the hostages will return home to their families.
God willing.
Thank you again. Thank you. This is Bryan Rudnick, Rally for the Republic, with Jonathan Feldstein of Genesis 123 Foundation. And thank you all for listening. And thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you for joining us on Rally for the Republic, where we are fighting for America's future. Visit 1776coalition.com. Rally for the Republic podcast is available on Spotify, Amazon, Apple, and Google Podcasts. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and download. Join Bryan Rudnick next time as we continue to fight for the American way of life and challenge the hypocrisy. This is Rally for the Republic.